Bizarrely, we had a run-in with the person accused of the murders of Chris and Barney, and a few years later, the same person was accused of a third gangland murder. He was acquitted of all three. The run-in we had with him came about when Tony was working on the door at a pub called the Puss in Boots. I went up to see him one night when he was working there. It was a Wednesday night, and as soon as I went in, I could sense there was an atmosphere. It was always packed on a Wednesday night at the Puss. They used to have karaoke on in there, which used to draw the crowds in. And when I walked in, I noticed a group of about 20 lads stood at the bar. And when I went up to the bar to get served, they just stood there and didn't move. One of them, who was stood side on to me, just turned his head and looked at me, arrogantly, then turned back again and carried on talking to his mates and didn't budge. Most people would have said, "Do you want to get served? There you go, mate," and step aside, but he didn't. He just ignored me. So I barged in between him and the lad he was talking to, and he said, "Oi, what's your game?" So I said, "Well, move out the way then. You can see I wanted to get served." And he glared at me for a second or two, and then moved about 2 inches. So I got served and went over to Tony, and I said to him, "You'll be earning your money tonight." And he said, "You mean them lot?" And looked at the lads stood at the bar and said, "Yeah, I know I will." Tony was working with his mate, and there were about a dozen of us talking to them both near the entrance. It was a nice summer's night, July time, so a little bit later on, we went and sat outside on one of the benches. The lads who were at the bar earlier were also sat outside by now, and one of them came and sat right in the middle of us and said to another Tony who was with us, "What's the problem?" So Tony said, "What are you on about? I haven't got a problem." So the lad said, "Yes, you have. I think you've got a problem with me." So Tony said, "Well, you're wrong. I haven't got a problem with you. I'm just having a drink with my mates." To be honest, it wouldn't have mattered what Tony would have said to him. He could have said sorry, not that there was anything to say sorry for, because he hadn't done anything. Or he could have said, "I don't want any trouble." He could have even offered to have bought the lad and all his mates their beer all night. But it would have made no difference, because the lad and his mates wanted trouble. So when the lad replied to Tony, "You've been looking at me all night," Tony didn't bother saying anything else. He just butted him in the face, and the fuse was lit. It went off proper. Fists flew, pint pots flew, the wooden benches that were sat on got launched, stools and chairs got launched and smashed over people's heads. The pub windows got smashed. A couple of cars in the car park got their windows smashed. They even ripped the metal sheet signs out of the ground, the no entry and the one-way type signs, and used the steel poles as weapons. And they hurled bricks and rocks and anything else they could get their hands on. It was mental. Then after they wrecked the place, they just went off. However, we didn't know that they were connected to the man who'd been accused of murdering Chris and Barney, Mr. A, as I'll refer to him, as for various reasons. And they went and told him that we'd attacked them for no reason. And about an hour later, as we were all stood in the foyer of the pub, a car pulled up and the lad who'd started it, the one who Tony butted, got out, and with him was Mr. A and another lad. The car was a BMW and it belonged to Mr. A, and sometime later I found out something quite interesting about it. It was bomb-proof and bulletproof. Someone also said that it used to belong to John Magnier, the Irish business magnate and thoroughbred stud owner, who was once a major shareholder of Manchester United. When Mr. A got out of the car, I saw him put something in his jacket pocket, but I didn't see what it was, and then someone who was stood with us shouted, "He's got a gun," and everyone, quite sensibly, scattered. Everyone, apart from me and Tony, that is. Tony didn't flinch. He just stood there. He had loads of bottle, did Tony. I just stood there too, though I think I just froze to the spot with fear. Tony was wearing fingerless gloves, the ones that weightlifters and bodybuilders sometimes wear. He also had his arm in plaster, as he'd broken his wrist a few weeks earlier. And when Mr. A came marching towards us with his mate, he looked at the gloves Tony had on and said, "Have you got those on for me?" implying that Tony had them on so he could hit him. Trying to calm the situation, I said, "No, he hasn't." But no sooner had I said it, Tony swung a punch at his mate, who was stood near him. But he didn't quite connect. It didn't help with his arm being in plaster. And if he would have connected, he'd have probably knocked the lad out, because Tony was a very good boxer. And so the lad threw a punch back, and as he did, Mr. A went to put his hand in his jacket pocket. Now, bearing in mind, he was a suspect for shooting Chris, and he was also a suspect in the murder of Barney, and there were rumours circulating I was on his hit list. And add to that, someone had just shouted that they'd seen him put a gun in his pocket he was reaching into. You could say I was ever so slightly nervous. My first thought was to grab the gun, so I ran at him and grabbed hold of him around his waist with both of my arms and ran him against the wall, where we ended up grappling with each other. And as we were wrestling with each other, I felt this almighty whack on the back of my head. His mate had hit me with a kosh. My knees went weak and I felt all dazed and lightheaded, and everything went blurred for a moment. It was like everything had gone into slow motion, and I felt like I was going to faint, and I went to a lollopy, and I slumped forward onto Mr. A. He must have thought I wanted to give him a cuddle, but he wasn't in a cuddling mood, and he just pushed me off. He then reached into his jacket and pulled something out. Because I was a bit dazed, I couldn't focus properly. I couldn't quite see what it was he pulled out. I could see that it was about 12 or 15 inches long, with a rounded end, and that it was fairly thick, but I couldn't see a trigger on it, so I thought, well, at least it's not a gun. And as he started belting me around the head with whatever it was, I thought, I wonder if he's been in my car and got that dildo out of the glove box. I was praying he hadn't, because if the brawl had made it to the local papers, the headline might have said, "No one shoots at the Puss in Boots, but have a go here who gets battered with his own dildo," which would have been a bit embarrassing for me. But it wasn't a gun or a dildo that he was battering me senseless with. It was a metal bat, which I later found out he called his equaliser. And the first blow landed right in the place where I'd been hit with the machete in the restaurant a few years previous, from which I still had the scar. And the blow from Mr. A's equaliser opened it up again, and blood pissed out. He didn't just hit me the once with it either. He hit me about 15 times with it, several of which landed on and around the machete wound, which made the wound even worse than it already was, and I ended up back in hospital late that night, getting it stitched up again. I've still got a dint in my head now from where I was coshed and macheted, and it's over 2 decades ago. You can stick your finger in it. That's not an invitation for you to come round and do it. I'm just saying you can. When the others who were initially stood with me and Tony, who scattered when they thought Mr. A had a gun, saw that it wasn't a gun, they came running back, which wasn't a very good idea on their part, because Mr. A started laying into them with his bat as well. The 3 of them eventually left, smashing the remaining unbroken windows as they did so, and a little while later the police arrived. The place was wrecked, and I was standing there covered from head to toe in blood. And when one of the coppers asked Tony what had gone on, he said, "Nothing. It's been pretty quiet tonight." Obviously we weren't going to assist them with their inquiries. You just don't, do you? The police knew they were wasting their time, even though it was plain to see something had gone on, or rather, had gone off. It looked like a bomb had gone off. Oddly enough, if a bomb had gone off, Mr. A's BMW would have remained intact. The police had already stopped his car up the road. Not that they could get him and his mates out of it, as they didn't have any bazookas with them to blow it open with. So Mr. A opened the door, and they got out and they arrested them. But even though they found a couple of bats in the car that were splattered in my blood, they weren't charged as we didn't make a complaint, though I was complaining of headaches for a few days afterwards. Both me and Tony got well and truly levered, no excuses. Though we were at a slight disadvantage, seeing as how Tony only had the one arm he could use and we didn't have any metal bats or rubber dildos to fight back with. But what goes round comes round, and the lad who started it all got his comeuppance not long after, when he did a similar thing at a nightclub in the town. Mr. A had already found out that he'd lied about what went on in the Puss in Boots, which he wasn't too happy about, and when the lad kicked off again, and once again expected Mr. A to clear up the mess, Mr. A took him for a little ride in the back of his car. But 10 minutes into the journey, Mr. A and a friend of his, who was with him, got a whiff of a foul stench coming from the back seat, and when Mr. A said, "What's that smell?" the lad informed them that he'd shit his pants. The thought of what was going to happen to him quite literally had scared him shitless. And Mr. A's car may well have been bomb-proof and bulletproof, but it wasn't shit-proof. And so, not wanting his interior splattered with diarrhoea, Mr. A and his friend kicked the lad out of his car and dumped him at the side of the road, where he was left to clear his own mess up for once. So that was an extract from the excellent book Machetes, Strange Ways and Police Corruptions by Nick Fisher. That was Nick Fisher. I was narrating, but it was about Nick Fisher and the run-in he had with Stockport's Mr. Big. I'm not going to mention his name, because it's obvious who it is, because out of respect to Nick Fisher, he doesn't want to mention in his book for whatever reasons. He's obviously friends with him, so we'll leave his name unsaid. However, just to give people a background of it who may not know the circumstances, or haven't watched my other videos on a guy called Chris Little, the Devil Dog Mobster. Chris Little and the author of this book, Nick Fisher, were best mates. Chris Little was one of the toughest, hardest men, gangsters, whatever you want to call him, around Stockport back then. A divisive character. Some would say he was a bully. He definitely did bully people, even his friend says that. Others say he was a good guy prior to that. But whatever the reason, he got murdered. Now this was after this. The Mr. Big that is mentioned, the Mr. A in this extract, was arrested for the murder, but I can't remember whether he was just released without charge or it was it got thrown out of court. But the Mr. Big had been up for a few different murders and was found not guilty, or they got thrown out on all three of them because he was innocent of them. And this book goes into a lot of the police corruption and different things. But I thought it was interesting. It was a very tense period, clearly, after that. And Nick Fisher, a big guy, a bodybuilder, etc. You know, there was rumours that he was going to be offed as well because he was friends with Chris Little. So it's quite tense times in and around Stockport. And this fight kicked off. So I thought it would make an interesting little extract. I've not had the time. I'm working on several documentaries, but I'm not rushing them. I'm taking my time with them. We've got also other things going on behind the scenes where we're going to be creating some professional documentaries for Amazon Prime and whatnot. So if I haven't finished the snippet ones, mini documentaries where they've got an actual documentary with them, what I'll do is I'll do an audio reading of some interesting stories, which may not have the images to go alongside them, etc. It's just an audio, but we'll just, you know, keep content coming out whilst we wait for the actual documentaries. Okay, so that's, with that being said, if you enjoyed it, please smash the likes, subscribe, hit the notifications. Until next time, that's the Inquirer out.